During a time of TV trays, Tupperware parties, and space-age dreams, families in the 1960s cooked with heart, humor, and whatever they had in the cupboard. They turned canned goods into comfort food, leftovers into legends, and dinner into a nightly ritual of togetherness. Today, I'm honoring those home cooks who filled their kitchens with the smell of casseroles, the sound of laughter, and the quiet magic of meals we should never forget: porcupine meatballs. Before the microwave, before Uber Eats, and certainly before kale chips, there were porcupine meatballs, an oddly charming name for a dish as comforting as an old quilt. The porcupine part, that came from the way white rice poked through the browned meatballs as they cooked, giving them a prickly little halo. Kids giggled at the name, and parents loved that it stretched a pound of ground beef into a hearty meal for a whole table.
I am making porcupine meatballs.
It was thrifty, it was filling, and it was about as 1960s as shag carpet and shag haircuts. Porcupine meatballs weren't a fancy affair. You wouldn't see them at a dinner party next to shrimp cocktail or a beef Wellington, but you'd sure find them bubbling away in a Pyrex dish on any working family's weekday table. The recipe itself was a hand-me-down from the Great Depression, when people got creative with whatever they had. But by the 60s, it had taken on a new life. Still frugal, but now proudly part of the era's casserole culture. The ingredients were humble but mighty. Ground beef, whatever was on sale that week, mixed with uncooked white rice, a splash of milk, and just enough onion to make it smell like real cooking. Some added an egg for binding. Others swore by a dash of Worcestershire for depth. Seasonings were simple: salt, pepper, and maybe a shake of garlic powder if you were feeling fancy. The meatballs were rolled tight by hand, lined up in a casserole dish, and then the real magic began. A can or two of tomato soup, thinned with water or broth, and poured right over the top. That tomato bath wasn't just for flavor, it softened the rice inside and turned the whole dish into a saucy, savory dream. As the meatballs baked, the rice inside would swell and peek out, giving them their porcupine look. The tomato soup would thicken into a comforting gravy that clung to every bite. The smell, rich and warm, would drift down hallways and pull kids away from their etch-a sketches. Served over mashed potatoes or with a hunk of white bread to mop up the sauce, it wasn't fancy. It was better. It was real. Porcupine meatballs may have fallen off the radar in the age of food trends and takeout apps, but one taste brings it all back. The crowded kitchen, the clatter of forks, the feeling that, just for that moment, everything you needed was right there at the table. Chicken a la king. There was a time when chicken a la king reigned supreme, gracing the chafing dishes of hotel brunches, ladies' luncheons, and midweek family dinners with equal flair. Creamy, delicate, and just fancy enough to feel a little special. It was the kind of dish that made you sit up a little straighter at the table. You didn't just eat chicken a la king, you served it, on toast points, over puff pastry shells, or spooned onto a steaming bed of white rice. However it arrived, it always felt like a little bit of high society on a humble plate. By the 1960s, chicken a la king had become a symbol of tasteful home cooking. It struck the perfect balance between elegance and ease, impressive enough for company, but built from ingredients most folks had on hand. Leftover Sunday roast chicken found new life in this creamy stew, rescued from boredom by mushrooms, peas, and pimentos. That pop of red and green was no accident. It gave the dish just the right amount of color to say, "I tried." The story of chicken a la king goes back further, maybe the early 1900s, maybe the Gilded Age, depending on which chef's tale you believe. Some say it was named after a hotel cook named King. Others claim it was a tribute to a patron or a playful spin on royal-sounding menus. But no matter where it came from, by the time the 60s rolled around, it had settled nicely into the American repertoire. It was often clipped from magazines, jotted on index cards, and passed around church circles with notes like "Helen's favorite" or "Use evaporated milk."
I'm going to make chicken a la king.
To make it, you'd start by melting butter in a heavy-bottom skillet and softening finely chopped onions and mushrooms until they gave up their fragrance. A spoonful of flour stirred in created a light roux, which thickened the milk or cream into a velvety sauce. Diced chicken was added, along with a handful of frozen peas and a scoop of diced pimentos for that signature flair. A gentle simmer melded everything together, and sometimes, just sometimes, a splash of sherry was stirred in at the end. Because this was, after all, a dish with a crown. Served hot, with the sauce clinging to every crevice of the pastry, or toast beneath it, chicken a la king was more than a meal. It was a little moment of sophistication tucked into the everyday. Today, it might seem like something from a bygone world, but one bite, and you remember why it was once the queen of the table. Tuna noodle casserole. If there's one dish that defines mid-century American resilience wrapped in a blanket of cream sauce, it's tuna noodle casserole. The name alone conjures visions of Pyrex dishes, avocado green kitchens, and the comforting clatter of Corningware lids. This was the go-to supper of the 1960s, humble, hearty, and born from the back of the pantry. It was the ultimate something-from-nothing meal, loved by frugal moms, picky kids, and anyone who came home after a long day looking for warmth on a plate.
We're making an old-fashioned tuna noodle casserole.
Tuna noodle casserole came into its prime in the post-war years, but by the 60s, it had achieved superstar status in the world of convenience cooking. This was a time when food was meant to be efficient, and every ingredient came in a can, a box, or a bag. Housewives were expected to feed a family of 5 with 1 pound of protein and an optimistic sense of flavor. Enter the casserole, and tuna noodle was the undisputed champ. It began with egg noodles, wide, ruffled, and soft enough to catch all that creamy sauce. A can or 2 of tuna, always packed in water or oil, got flaked in with a fork and stirred into the noodles. The sauce? That was a job for cream of mushroom soup. Campbell's was the brand of choice, its salty, savory magic, turning humble ingredients into a cohesive, indulgent mix. Some cooks added milk to stretch it, a handful of frozen peas for color, or diced celery for crunch. If you had shredded cheese, you threw it in. If you didn't, no one noticed. But the real crown jewel was the topping, crushed potato chips. Not breadcrumbs, not cracker crumbs, but potato chips. Salty, crispy, and a little greasy, they formed a golden crust in the oven that gave the soft, gooey casserole the perfect bite. Some folks used cornflakes or buttered Ritz, but for many, nothing said, "Mom made dinner," like the sight of those ridged chips going into the oven. After about 30 minutes in a 350-degree oven, the whole kitchen would smell like comfort. It was the scent of busy lives, tight budgets, and the kind of cooking that didn't need to be gourmet. It just needed to be good enough. When scooped onto a plate, the casserole oozed warmth and familiarity. It stuck to your ribs and your memories. Today, tuna noodle casserole might seem like a relic of the past, but it's the kind of dish that speaks louder with every bite. It's food that remembers where it came from and reminds us that with a can of tuna, a bag of noodles, and a little creativity, dinner is never far away. Deviled ham salad. There was always a little mystery to deviled ham salad. It didn't look like much, just a mound of pinkish spread in a small bowl or scooped between 2 slices of squishy white bread, but it had a boldness about it, a zing. A secret kick that made your tongue perk up and your eyebrows raise just a little. This wasn't the demure sandwich filling of cucumber or egg salad fame. No, deviled ham came in swinging. It was loud, it was spicy, it was weirdly wonderful. By the 1960s, deviled ham salad had already been around for decades, but it found its sweet spot in that post-war era of convenience and curiosity. It was the sandwich you made when you had exactly 10 minutes, 1 can opener, and half a loaf of bread. It showed up in lunchboxes and at picnics, in triangle-shaped tea sandwiches for bridge club, and in wax paper-wrapped stacks at roadside rest stops.
I'm going to make a deviled ham spread with this ham.
Deviled ham, usually from a little white can with a red devil logo, was processed, sure, but in the best, most unapologetically American way. It was meat you could spread. What could be more modern? To make a proper deviled ham salad, you started with that little can of devil-branded ham, finely ground, deeply salty, and tinged with just enough smoky sweetness. Into a mixing bowl it went, along with a generous dollop of mayonnaise to smooth it out. Then came the zip. A spoonful of yellow mustard, a few shakes of hot sauce, maybe a dash of vinegar or pickle juice if you liked it tangy. Sweet pickle relish was non-negotiable for many, a sugary crunch that balanced out all that savory punch. And for those who liked a little texture, a handful of finely chopped celery or onions might make an appearance. Everything got mixed until it turned into a creamy, pale pink mash with tiny flecks of green or white peeking through. You could serve it cold, mounded on a leaf of iceberg lettuce if you were feeling fancy, or just slathered on crackers for a quick snack. But the sandwich was where it shone, spread thick between 2 slices of soft bread, crusts cut off if company was coming, and cut on the diagonal just because that's how your mom did it. There was a boldness to deviled ham salad that other sandwich spreads just didn't have. It didn't whisper, it hollered. And maybe that's why it's faded from popularity in our age of artisanal charcuterie and 12-grain bread. But one bite of that creamy, spicy, strangely addictive spread, and you remember, food doesn't have to be fancy to be unforgettable. Sometimes it just needs a little devil in it. Ham steak with pineapple, rings. Few things say mid-century dinner, quite like the sizzle of a thick-cut ham steak browning in a cast-iron skillet, crowned with golden rings of pineapple that practically sparkle under the broiler. It was a dish that looked fancy without trying, sweet without being cloying, and easy enough for even the most harried 1960s home cook to master. This was a meal that walked the tightrope between elegance and kitsch. A little tropical, a little traditional, and completely unforgettable. Ham steak with pineapple rings was a darling of suburban dining, especially as the post-war obsession with Polynesian flair made its way into everyday American kitchens. Tiki bars were in vogue, pineapple was considered exotic, and canned fruit of any kind was treated like a culinary upgrade. What once would have been plain old ham suddenly had flair, color, and a syrupy glaze that made the whole meal feel like a celebration. It didn't hurt that it was cheap, too, especially when a whole ham wasn't in the budget, but a thick slice or two could still turn heads. The ingredient list was as short as a weeknight shopping list should be. A slab of ham steak, usually bone-in and cut about an inch thick, was the centerpiece. It didn't require much dressing up because it already came salty, smoky, and ready to sear. The pineapple came from a can, of course. Those perfectly uniform rings, packed in juice or heavy syrup, depending on your sweet tooth. And then, for that extra flair, maraschino cherries, plucked from their jar and nestled right into the center of each pineapple ring, like a little edible jewel. To make it, you'd start by heating up your skillet, preferably cast iron, though any sturdy pan would do. The ham steak went in with a bit of butter, or its own rendered fat, and as it sizzled, the edges crisped and the kitchen filled with that unmistakable meaty aroma. Once browned, the pineapple rings were arranged lovingly over the top, with cherries tucked in like a child's finishing touch. A drizzle of brown sugar or a spoonful of the canned syrup could go over everything, and then the whole dish might take a quick trip under the broiler to caramelize. Served with mashed potatoes, green beans, or even a scoop of cottage cheese on a lettuce leaf, as was the style, ham steak with pineapple rings was equal parts nostalgic and satisfying. The sweet and savory combo felt indulgent, even if it came together in 15 minutes flat. It was food for families, for neighbors dropping by, for nights when you wanted dinner to feel just a little bit special. And though the pineapple ham pairing might seem old-fashioned now, one forkful will remind you, this flavor duo didn't just survive the 60s, it defined them. Jell-O mold salad. Ah, the shimmering crown jewel of 1960s dining tables, the Jell-O mold salad. It was dazzling, a little bizarre, and proudly displayed like edible stained glass in a ring mold or bundt pan. You didn't just serve it, you unveiled it. With a confident flip and a dramatic lift of the mold, this wobbly wonder would jiggle its way into center stage, met with gasps, polite smiles, and the occasional nervous fork tap. It was dessert and salad, side dish and spectacle, all in one. The 1960s were absolutely smitten with gelatin. It represented everything modern: science in the kitchen, color on the plate, and control over chaos. What better way to show off your homemaking prowess than suspending vegetables, fruits, cheeses, even meats in a Technicolor dome of lemon or lime Jell-O? If you could dream it, you could encase it. Now, there were endless variations of Jell-O salad, but the most iconic of the decade, and the one that truly earned its place in history, was the lime green variety with crushed pineapple, chopped nuts, and a generous scoop of cottage cheese. Sometimes it had shredded carrots or diced celery for crunch. Other times, it leaned sweet with miniature marshmallows or canned pears. And always, it was served chilled to a degree just shy of icy, its firm quiver announcing its presence before a single bite was taken. To make it, you'd start by dissolving a packet of lime Jell-O in boiling water, stirring until every sugar crystal vanished. Then came the cold water, or sometimes crushed pineapple juice straight from the can, for cooling things down. As the gelatin began to thicken slightly, in went the mix-ins. Cottage cheese gave it a creamy bite, the pineapple brought tang, and chopped walnuts or pecans added a little crunch to every jiggle. If marshmallows were involved, they were folded in last like some sort of edible confetti. Once everything was incorporated, the whole concoction was poured into a greased mold and left to set in the fridge, sometimes overnight for maximum firmness. Unmolding it was the real test of skill. You'd dip the mold quickly in warm water, then flip it onto a chilled serving platter with hope and a silent prayer. If it held its shape, and oh, when it did, you had a showstopper. Sometimes garnished with a dollop of mayo or a sprig of parsley. Because why not? This salad wasn't just a side, it was a moment. Jell-O mold salad may baffle modern palates, but back then it was high art, a testament to a time when food was fun, festive, and fearlessly fluorescent. TV dinner Salisbury steak. There was a kind of magic in peeling back the foil lid of a TV dinner tray in the 1960s. Inside those segmented compartments lay the future, or so it seemed. Neatly separated meat, vegetable, and dessert all nestled together in an aluminum tray that could go from freezer to oven without so much as dirtying a pan. And the crown jewel of all TV dinners, Salisbury steak. Brown, smothered in gravy, and sitting in its own little pool of nostalgia, it was as close to a homemade meal as the freezer aisle could get. Salisbury steak wasn't a newcomer to the American table. It had roots in the late 19th century, when Dr. James Salisbury advocated for ground beef as a health food. But by the 1960s, it had transformed into a staple of the prepackaged dinner revolution. Hearty, dependable, and microwavable, once microwaves entered the picture, of course. For families juggling work, school, and a growing love of television, TV dinners were a godsend. Pop one in the oven, wait 25 minutes, and dinner was done. No muss, no fuss, no dishes. The Salisbury steak itself was essentially a seasoned ground beef patty, often mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and egg, like a flatter, saucier cousin to meatloaf. It was pre-shaped, pre-cooked, and pre-gravied. That dark, thick gravy, flecked with bits of onion and mushroom, was what made it special. It turned a frozen puck of meat into something warm and comforting. Alongside the steak came a scoop of mashed potatoes, some token green beans or corn, and always, a tiny square of dessert. Maybe apple crisp, maybe brownie, maybe a gooey cherry cobbler that never quite stayed in its compartment. As you sat on the shag carpet, tray balanced on a folding TV stand, you could watch Bonanza or I Love Lucy while cutting into your meal with the side of a plastic fork. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even particularly pretty, but it was satisfying, efficient, and deeply tied to the rhythms of a modern household. In that little tray was freedom. Freedom from cooking, from scrubbing pots, from planning a menu. It was dinner simplified, made for the new pace of life. Today, TV dinners feel like kitsch, something retro for collectors or novelty seekers. But back then, a Salisbury steak TV dinner was a promise. A hot meal after a long day, a slice of convenience in an era learning to juggle it all. And yes, maybe the peas were a little rubbery, and maybe the potatoes had the texture of paste. But to a hungry kid with their eyes on the screen, it tasted just fine. Better than fine, even. It tasted like the future. Cheese soufflé. Back in the 1960s, if you really wanted to impress someone, your bridge club, your mother-in-law, or even just your own reflection in the mirror, you made a cheese soufflé. This was not your everyday dinner. No, a soufflé was an event. It was elegant, dramatic, and just precarious enough to earn you a kitchen badge of honor. Watching it puff and rise in the oven felt like witnessing a miracle. And when it worked, oh honey, you were practically Julia Child. Now, the word soufflé might have French roots, but by the mid-century, it had made its way into American cookbooks and kitchens with gusto. It wasn't as complicated as people feared, though it sounded complicated, which was half the appeal. To serve a cheese soufflé in the 60s was to say, yes, I can cook, and yes, I've read at least one gourmet magazine. It was refined without being fussy, rich without being heavy, and always best when eaten right out of the oven, standing tall and proud. The ingredients were deceptively simple: butter, flour, milk, eggs, and cheese. But the magic was all in the method. First, you made a bechamel, a creamy white sauce made by whisking flour into melted butter, then slowly adding warm milk until it thickened to a satin-like texture. Once off the heat, you'd stir in sharp grated cheese, usually cheddar or Gruyere if you were fancy, and then season it with a pinch of dry mustard, a touch of nutmeg, and salt and pepper. Now came the heart-pounding part, separating the eggs. The yolks were stirred into the cheese sauce, one at a time, turning the whole mixture a warm, custardy yellow. Then the whites were whipped by hand, or, if you were lucky, with a sunbeam mixer, until stiff peaks formed. Folding those egg whites into the warm cheese base took patience and a light touch. Too much stirring, and your soufflé would fall flat. Too little, and you'd get weird white streaks. But if you got it just right, you poured that airy batter into a buttered and breadcrumb-dusted soufflé dish, slid it into the oven, and shut the door ever so gently. Then you waited, and prayed, and peeked just once. When it emerged, golden and towering, it was a thing of beauty, like a savory cloud, puffed with pride, served with a crisp salad and a glass of white wine, or iced tea in a floral glass. Cheese soufflé was dinner with dignity, a throwback to a time when home cooks dared to rise to the occasion, and so did their eggs. Fried bologna sandwich. There was nothing gourmet about a fried bologna sandwich, and that was exactly the point. It was the lunch of latchkey kids, the savior of empty refrigerators, and the working man's quick fix after a long shift. In the 1960s, it was everywhere. Diners, lunch counters, lunch boxes, and greasy skillets across the country. No frills, no pretense. Just a slice or two of humble bologna, sizzling in a pan, curling up like a little pink hat as it cooked. Served between two slices of bread, sometimes with a slap of mustard or a slice of cheese, this was blue-collar comfort food at its absolute finest. Bologna itself had a long journey before it landed on American sandwich bread. A distant cousin of the Italian mortadella, it arrived in the States as an affordable deli meat, quickly becoming a staple of frugal households. By the time the 1960s rolled around, you'd find a red-ringed chub of bologna in almost every fridge, ready to be peeled, sliced, and pan-fried at a moment's notice. It was cheap, it was salty, and it could feed a crowd with just a few pieces of white bread and a hot skillet. Making a fried bologna sandwich was less about a recipe and more about rhythm. You'd heat up a frying pan, cast iron if you were lucky, and drop in your bologna slices. Almost instantly, they'd start to sizzle and curl, the edges bubbling and crisping like bacon with a diploma in processed meats. Some folks made a little slit in the center to stop the curl, while others leaned into the chaos and let it puff up like a balloon. Either way, once the meat was browned and crispy at the edges, it was ready. Now came the layering. Bread was usually soft white, toasted if you had the extra few minutes. A swipe of yellow mustard was common, but mayonnaise or even ketchup weren't unheard of. A slice of American cheese, half melted from the heat of the bologna, added a perfect creamy counterpoint to the salty meat. Add a few pickle chips or a leaf of iceberg if you had them. But truly, it didn't need much. This sandwich didn't try to impress. It wasn't served with truffle fries or artisan aioli, but it got the job done, and then some. It filled your belly, warmed your hands, and maybe brought a little joy in the form of a crispy edge or a drippy corner. It was lunch that didn't need a lunchbox, food that didn't need a fork, and a reminder that sometimes the best meals are the simplest ones, the ones you make when there's nothing else in the fridge but bologna, and that's more than enough. Stuffed bell peppers. Before meal prep was a trend and one-dish dinner became a marketing phrase, there were stuffed bell peppers. Colorful, comforting, and quietly majestic. In the 1960s, these beauties were a weeknight wonder. Each pepper was like a little edible treasure chest, brimming with seasoned meat and rice, bubbling under a blanket of tomato sauce. They looked fancy enough for company, yet came from the same ingredients you'd use for a Tuesday night meatloaf. That was their charm. Ordinary parts, extraordinary presentation. The bell peppers themselves, usually green, sometimes red if you were feeling wild, served as nature's own casserole dish. They stood tall in the baking pan, hollowed out with care, their sturdy sides ready to hold whatever filling a creative home cook could come up with. This dish was rooted in frugality and flexibility. It was a way to stretch a pound of ground beef into something that felt complete and nourishing, all without dirtying more than one bowl and a casserole dish. The filling was straightforward and satisfying. Ground beef browned in a skillet, mixed with cooked white rice, a little onion, garlic if you had it, and a splash of Worcestershire or ketchup for tang. Seasonings were simple: salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of oregano or parsley. Some recipes added corn, some tossed in a handful of shredded cheese, and some even snuck in a diced tomato or two. The mixture was spooned into each pepper like mortar into a brick mold, mounted slightly above the rim with a confidence that said, "This will be delicious." Once stuffed, the peppers were placed upright in a casserole dish, sometimes propped against one another like soldiers standing at attention. Then came the sauce, a rich tomato concoction poured over the top, made from canned tomato soup, crushed tomatoes, or tomato sauce, depending on the pantry and the cook. As the dish baked in the oven, the peppers softened and sweetened. The filling absorbed the sauce, and the aroma wrapped around the house like a culinary hug. Served hot, maybe with a scoop of mashed potatoes or a slice of buttered bread, stuffed bell peppers offered the best kind of old-fashioned satisfaction. They were tidy, flavorful, and deeply comforting. And when you cut into one, knife sliding through tender pepper, fork catching the savory filling inside, you felt like someone had made something just for you. A whole meal in one perfect package. That was the genius of the 60s kitchen. Chicken divan. Back in the 1960s, when casseroles ruled the dinner table and cream-based sauces were treated like royalty, chicken divan was the queen. Elegant, yet easy, creamy, but not too rich. It was the sort of dish you made when you wanted to feel just a little bit fancy without straying too far from your pantry staples. Served in long glass baking dishes and often brought out for guests or Sunday suppers, chicken divan combined everyday ingredients into something that looked like it belonged on the menu of a white tablecloth restaurant, or at least in the glossy pages of Good Housekeeping. The name divan sounded mysterious, maybe even European, but the dish itself was born in New York City in the early 20th century, named after the Divan Parisian restaurant in the Chatham Hotel. By the time it made its way into suburban kitchens during the 60s, it had become a symbol of culinary grace with a budget-friendly backbone. Broccoli, considered a bit of a novelty vegetable at the time, was its defining green flourish, paired with chunks of tender chicken and a rich, velvety sauce. Cooks would often start with leftover roast chicken or even canned chicken in a pinch. The broccoli was usually frozen, boiled briefly until just tender, then layered neatly into a casserole dish with the shredded chicken on top. The sauce was a creamy dream made from condensed cream of chicken or mushroom soup, thinned with a splash of milk or sour cream, and stirred together with sharp cheddar cheese. Some versions called for mayonnaise or even a squeeze of lemon juice to brighten things up, but the core flavor was always rich, savory, and just a touch tangy. Once everything was layered and blanketed in the golden sauce, it was topped with more cheese, or, if you were really aiming to impress, a scattering of buttered breadcrumbs for a crispy, golden finish. Into the oven it went, bubbling and browning until the edges turned slightly crisp and the smell filled the entire house with cozy, creamy anticipation. Chicken divan was a dish that said, "I made an effort." It was dependable but dressy, comforting without being dull. Served with white rice or egg noodles, maybe a fruit salad on the side, it was the kind of meal that brought everyone to the table with eager forks and second helping smiles. Today it might seem old-fashioned, but once you taste it again, you'll wonder why we ever let it fade. Mock lobster, hot dogs, and paprika. Now this one might raise an eyebrow, but bear with us, because in the resourceful kitchens of the 1960s, mock lobster was a thing of quiet genius. It was the kind of dish born not out of luxury, but out of necessity and pure culinary imagination. You didn't need a lobster pot or an ocean view, just a pack of hot dogs, a saucepan, and a good sprinkle of paprika. And somehow, by kitchen magic or sheer optimism, it worked. It really, strangely, worked. Mock lobster was part of a larger trend of mock recipes that swept the mid-century cookbook scene. Mock apple pie, made with crackers, mock duck, usually beef or pork, and yes, mock lobster, meant to give working-class families a taste of something fancy without blowing the budget. It was comfort food dressed up in pretend pearls. It didn't matter if it fooled your taste buds or not. It brought fun to the table, and for many households, that counted just as much. The ingredients couldn't have been simpler. Standard issue hot dogs, beef, pork, or a mystery mix, sliced on a bias into little medallions. A bit of butter or margarine went into a skillet to start things off, followed by a generous shake of paprika, which gave the whole thing its signature orange-red hue and just a hint of smoky flavor. Some folks added a splash of lemon juice or a few dashes of hot sauce to brighten it up and mimic the tang of seafood, while others leaned into the butter and spice alone. The sliced hot dogs were tossed into the skillet, where they sizzled and seared, soaking up the buttery spice bath and curling ever so slightly at the edges. As they cooked, they took on a texture that, if you closed your eyes and used a little imagination, offered just a whisper of shellfish. Not lobster exactly, but not plain old hot dog either. The transformation wasn't in the ingredients so much as the intention. Served over a slice of toast or a bed of white rice, mock lobster made for a fun and surprisingly satisfying supper. It was salty, buttery, just spicy enough, and undeniably quirky. Sometimes it came with a side of green peas or canned fruit cocktail, the kind of mismatched meal that somehow made perfect sense in the context of a busy weeknight. It may not win awards for authenticity, but mock lobster is a reminder of what made 1960s cooking so special. It was creative, unpretentious, and willing to try anything once, even turning a hot dog into a seafood dinner. Swedish meatballs. There was something undeniably classy about Swedish meatballs in the 1960s. They weren't flashy or fussy, but they carried a kind of quiet elegance. Served in a chafing dish at cocktail parties, or as the centerpiece of a sit-down dinner, spooned over buttered egg noodles or fluffy rice. These weren't your average spaghetti and sauce meatballs. No, Swedish meatballs were softer, smaller, more refined, bathed in a creamy gravy that made you feel like you were dining somewhere much colder and more dignified than your own linoleum-floored kitchen. They came to American tables via potluck gatherings and church cookbooks, part of the wider fascination with international flair that swept mid-century households. Everything from fondue to chow mein got a suburban spin, and Swedish meatballs became a particular favorite. They felt worldly, continental even, but didn't stray too far from the comfort zone. If you could make a meatloaf, you could make these. And once you did, you usually made them again. The meat mixture was a gentle blend, often a 50-50 mix of ground beef and pork, combined with a splash of milk, some breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and plenty of finely chopped onion. The seasoning leaned toward the warm and fragrant, salt, pepper, and always a whisper of allspice or nutmeg. That tiny hit of spice gave the meatballs their distinctly Northern European soul, something subtle but unmistakable. The mixture was rolled into small, tender balls, smaller than Italian ones, about the size of a walnut, and browned in butter until golden on all sides. But the magic was in the sauce. Once the meatballs were removed, the same pan was deglazed with a bit of broth, beef or chicken, depending on what was on hand. Then came the cream, or sometimes sour cream, swirled in to create a velvety, pale gravy that clung to the spoon. Some versions added a spoonful of flour to thicken it. Others kept it loose and silky. Either way, once the meatballs were returned to the pan, the whole thing simmered gently until the flavors married and the gravy turned glossy. Served hot, with their sauce spilling lazily over noodles or rice, Swedish meatballs were both cozy and impressive. They fit in just as easily at a holiday gathering as they did on a random Tuesday night. Add a spoonful of lingonberry jam on the side if you were going full traditional, or grape jelly if you were improvising the American way. Swedish meatballs were the kind of dish that said you can travel the world even if your passport's expired and your station wagon's out of gas. All it takes is a skillet, a few spices, and a little cream. Beef stroganoff. If you had dinner at someone's house in the 1960s and they brought out beef stroganoff, you knew they were pulling out all the stops. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill casserole or pantry special. This was elegance on a plate, with a side of sophistication. Stroganoff had foreign flair, creamy richness, and a name that sounded like it came straight from a Russian opera. It was worldly, grown up, and just the right amount of indulgent, especially when served over a buttery bed of egg noodles with a flourish, and maybe a sprig of parsley if someone had a garden. The dish had roots in 19th century Russia, but by the time it hit mid-century America, it had been given a canned soup makeover and a spot in every ambitious homemaker's recipe box. It was exotic enough to impress dinner guests, but practical enough for a weeknight. The Cold War may have chilled politics, but it didn't stop Americans from loving a good Russian recipe, especially when it came with mushrooms, cream, and tender beef. To make it, you started with beef, usually sirloin or round steak, sliced into thin strips. The pieces were seared quickly in a hot skillet with a bit of butter or oil, just enough to brown the edges while keeping the inside tender. Then came the mushrooms, white button or cremini if you were lucky, sliced and sautéed until golden and fragrant. Onions were added, sautéed until soft and sweet, blending into the earthy, beefy base. Some traditionalists made the sauce from scratch, starting with a beef broth reduction and finishing with sour cream for tang and richness. But many 1960s cooks weren't above grabbing a can of cream of mushroom soup and a scoop of sour cream, stirring them together into a luscious, slightly tangy sauce that coated everything like velvet. A splash of Worcestershire or dry mustard gave it a deeper bite, and sometimes a little white wine or sherry made its way in, especially if company was coming. Once everything was combined, beef, mushrooms, sauce, the dish was simmered just long enough to bring it all together, then poured generously over wide egg noodles. The noodles soaked up the gravy, each ribbon coated with creamy, savory goodness, a sprinkle of parsley, maybe a side of buttered peas. And dinner was served. Rich, rib-sticking, and just the right amount of showy. Beef stroganoff was more than just a meal. It was a statement. It said you could cook. It said you knew your way around a saucepan. And it said, most of all, that even in a world of casseroles and canned beans, there was still room for a little flair. Spam and eggs. There's something deeply satisfying about the sizzle of spam hitting a hot skillet. It's a sound that says breakfast is about to be served, even if it's 3 in the afternoon. In the 1960s, spam and eggs was more than just a meal. It was a mindset. It said, we're feeding the family with what we've got, and we're making it taste good. Whether you were in a farmhouse kitchen, a tiny apartment, or a camper parked by the lake, spam and eggs brought comfort, protein, and a little salty satisfaction to the table. Spam had already earned its stripes by the 1960s. Introduced in the late 1930s, it was a World War II hero, shipped across oceans to feed soldiers in mess halls and trenches. But after the war, it never left. It became a pantry staple in post-war America, a little pink brick of potential, wrapped in metal and mystery. Housewives loved its long shelf life and versatility. Kids loved its savory flavor and crispy edges. And in the era of convenience cooking, few things were quicker or more satisfying than a couple of slices of fried Spam next to a pile of fluffy scrambled eggs. The preparation was blissfully simple. You'd start by opening that iconic can, usually with a key that twisted around like an old sardine tin. Out came the firm, gelatinous block of meat, which was then sliced into neat rectangles, thick or thin depending on your preference. Some folks liked theirs barely crisped. Others wanted those edges browned like bacon and almost crunchy. Either way, a hot skillet did the trick, transforming the soft, salty meat into something golden, aromatic, and just greasy enough to be delicious. The eggs could be scrambled, fried, or even poached if you were feeling fancy. Most went with scrambled, quick, reliable, and ready in minutes. A splash of milk or cream made them fluffy. A pat of butter in the pan gave them flavor, and a sprinkle of salt and pepper finished the job. Toss in some shredded cheese or green onions if you had them. If not, no one complained. Served side by side on a simple plate, maybe with a slice of toast or a biscuit on the side, Spam and eggs was honest food. It wasn't trying to be trendy. It didn't care about Instagram likes or farm-to-table sourcing. It just wanted to fill you up and make you smile, and somehow it did. One bite of that crispy Spam, chased by soft, buttery eggs, and you were home, wherever that happened to be. In a time when America was racing toward modernity, Spam and eggs reminded everyone that sometimes the best meals come in the simplest packages. Tang marinated chicken. If you grew up in the 1960s, chances are you remember Tang, the bright orange, space-age powdered drink mix that astronauts supposedly took to the moon. It wasn't just a breakfast beverage, it was a badge of modernity. A little scoop of citrus-colored progress right from the jar. But what you might not remember is that Tang didn't stop at the cup. Oh no, it made its way into marinades, salad dressings, even glazes. And perhaps the boldest, most surprisingly delicious of them all, Tang marinated chicken. This was innovation, plain and simple. Housewives who read Better Homes and Gardens or swapped recipes at Tupperware parties were always on the hunt for something new to do with chicken breasts or drumsticks. Tang provided that unexpected punch. Sweet, tangy, and slightly acidic, making it a perfect tenderizer and flavor booster all in one. It was like citrus, only futuristic. And with a flavor that bright, it turned a plain piece of poultry into something worthy of a second helping. The marinade was a curious concoction, but beloved by those who dared. A few spoonfuls of Tang powder dissolved in water gave the base its orange hue and sugary tang. Then came soy sauce for depth, a little oil for richness, and often garlic powder, onion powder, or a dash of ginger to round it all out. Some added a splash of vinegar or a glug of Worcestershire sauce, depending on what kind of flavor profile they were chasing. Tropical, Asian-inspired, or just good and garlicky. The chicken, usually thighs or drumsticks, was tossed in the marinade and left to soak for several hours in the fridge. When it was time to cook, you had options. Bake it in the oven until golden and sticky, grill it over charcoal for that smoky finish, or even broil it for crisp skin and caramelized edges. No matter the method, the result was always the same. A glossy, orange-tinged masterpiece with a flavor that was equal parts sweet, sour, savory, and downright groovy. Served with a scoop of rice or a side of canned pineapple rings, because why not double down on the theme? Tang marinated chicken was a dinner that got people talking. It wasn't what you expected, it was better. It captured the spirit of 1960s cooking perfectly. Experimental, cheerful, and unafraid to try something delightfully weird. Tang might have promised to take you to space, but in this dish, it brought the stars right to your dinner table. Macaroni salad with Miracle Whip. In the summertime kitchens of the 1960s, before air conditioners hummed in every home, there were cold dishes that came to the rescue. And macaroni salad with Miracle Whip was the star of the Tupperware parade. Creamy, sweet, tangy, and dotted with colorful little bits of this and that. It was a staple at potlucks, church picnics, and backyard barbecues, where folding lawn chairs and paper plates made up the dining room. This wasn't some fancy deli-style salad. It was pure, unapologetic Americana, and it chilled like a champ in any Frigidaire. At first glance, it was humble, but beneath its creamy surface lay the secret to its staying power: balance. It was soft, it was crunchy, it was savory, and just a little sweet. And that sweetness came from none other than Miracle Whip, a salad dressing that had divided households and dinner tables for decades. Love it or loathe it, Miracle Whip wasn't mayonnaise. It had that telltale zip, a sugary tang that gave macaroni salad its unmistakable flavor and made it taste like summer on a spoon. The salad began with elbow macaroni, Classic, unpretentious, and cooked just past al dente so it could soak up the dressing. Once drained and cooled, the pasta became a blank canvas for whatever the home cook had on hand. Chopped celery gave it crunch, while diced bell peppers, often green or red, offered bursts of color. Grated carrot made an appearance more often than not, adding a soft sweetness and a splash of orange to the mix. And for those who liked a little salt to cut the sweet, cubed cheddar or sliced black olives might sneak in. Then came the dressing, a generous helping of Miracle Whip, thinned slightly with milk or vinegar and seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of sugar if the cook was feeling bold. A spoonful of yellow mustard added a gentle tang and a bit of sunshine color. The whole bowl was stirred until every noodle gleamed with creamy goodness, then chilled until flavors melded and memories formed. Macaroni salad with Miracle Whip was more than a side dish. It was a social event. It sat proudly next to hot dogs and hamburgers. It cooled you down while the grill heated up, and it somehow tasted even better the next day. Kids scooped it up with potato chips, adults heaped it beside ribs and slaw, and everyone had an opinion on what should go in it. But one thing was for sure. When this salad came to the table, it never lasted long. It was cool, comforting, and coated in that unmistakable 1960s optimism. Sweet, tangy, and ready for anything. Tater tot hot dish. In the upper Midwest during the 1960s, where winters were long and casseroles were king, the tater tot hot dish reigned supreme. This wasn't just a meal, it was a cultural cornerstone, a bubbling, golden-topped miracle born from cans, freezer bags, and a deep sense of community. Whether it showed up at a Lutheran church supper or a Tuesday night dinner table in rural Minnesota, this dish had one job: feed everyone fast. And it never failed. The brilliance of the tater tot hot dish was its simplicity. It was practical, comforting, and wildly adaptable, a culinary hug in a 9x13 pan. It didn't pretend to be fancy. It didn't come from France or have an unpronounceable name. It came from the land of potlucks, snow boots, and hot coffee. It came from the heartland. At its core, it began with ground beef, browned in a skillet, seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a bit of onion or garlic if you were feeling ambitious. Once the meat was cooked, in went a can of cream of mushroom soup, or cream of chicken if that's what you had, stirred until everything was coated in that thick, creamy goodness. Some cooks added frozen green beans or corn straight from the bag, still icy, trusting the oven to do its job. Others added peas or a few sliced mushrooms, maybe a sprinkle of cheese for flair, but the basics remained the same: meat, sauce, veg. Then came the moment of glory, layering the tater tots on top. Perfectly aligned or tossed on with abandon, it didn't matter. The tots were the crown. As they baked, they turned golden and crisp, forming a crunchy contrast to the soft, savory filling beneath. The smell filled the kitchen with that unmistakable scent of something hearty and hot, a dish that promised full bellies and maybe even seconds. You served it straight from the pan, no garnish needed. A scoop landed on the plate with a satisfying plop, a mixture of creamy beef, tender veggies, and crispy potato on top. It was comfort in its purest form, hot, humble, and handed down through generations. In the 1960s, when dinner had to be fast, filling, and made from what was on hand, tater tot hot dish delivered every time. It was the great equalizer, beloved by farmers, factory workers, and suburban families alike. And if you ask anyone who grew up with it, they'll tell you, it might not look like much, but it tastes like home. Liver and onions. To many kids of the 1960s, liver and onions was the dreaded dinner of the week. The smell alone, rich, iron-heavy, and unmistakably earthy, would send them scrambling for a sudden homework emergency or an early bedtime. But to the grown-ups, especially those raised on Depression-era thrift and wartime rationing, this dish was a badge of honor. It was economical, nutritious, and deeply satisfying if you had the taste for it. Liver and onions wasn't just a meal. It was a tradition, passed down by folks who knew how to make the most of every part of the animal. It was especially common in working-class homes, where every dollar had to stretch and protein couldn't go to waste. Liver was cheap, plentiful, and packed with vitamins, iron, B12, and all the things your grandmother swore would put color in your cheeks. The onions helped temper the liver's strong flavor and offered a sweetness that, when done right, brought the whole dish into balance. Preparation started with slicing the beef liver into manageable strips or medallions, usually soaked in milk first to tame the bitterness. That soaking step was a well-guarded trick in many households, a sign that someone had taken care and pride in what they were making. While the liver rested, Onions were sliced thin and slowly sautéed in a big skillet with plenty of butter or bacon grease until they turned golden, soft, and nearly caramelized. Once the onions were done, they were set aside, and the liver hit the same pan, sizzling in the leftover fat. Cooked quickly, just a few minutes on each side to keep it tender, it was then reunited with the onions for a final sauté. Some cooks added a dash of Worcestershire sauce or beef broth to deglaze the pan and make a light gravy. Others kept it simple, letting the liver's flavor do the talking. Liver and onions was often served with mashed potatoes, creamed peas, or a big slice of buttered white bread to mop up the juices. It was hearty and deeply old-fashioned, the kind of meal that didn't apologize for itself. You either loved it or you didn't, but no one forgot it. In today's world of kale smoothies and quinoa bowls, liver and onions might feel like a relic, but to those who grew up on it, it tastes like strength, like resourcefulness, like something real. It's a dish that demanded respect and gave plenty in return. Chipped beef on toast. It might not win any beauty contests, but chipped beef on toast, affectionately, or not so affectionately, known as SOS, was one of the most iconic meals of mid-century America. Served in military mess halls, school cafeterias, and thrifty home kitchens alike, this dish was cheap, filling, and ready in minutes. It didn't care about presentation. It was humble, salty, and unapologetically beige. But for the generation that grew up with it, SOS wasn't just food, it was a culinary rite of passage. The name, of course, has a colorful origin. In military slang, SOS stood for stuff on a shingle, though the actual wording was usually a bit more colorful than stuff. It was a staple during World War II in Korea, where it fed thousands of troops with minimal ingredients and maximum efficiency. When soldiers came home, many brought the recipe with them, and soon chipped beef on toast was showing up in home kitchens across the country, especially in the 1950s and 60s, when quick, frugal meals were a way of life. The backbone of the dish was chipped beef, which came in thin, salty slices packed into little glass jars. It wasn't fancy, it was preserved and shelf-stable, but it had a briny, concentrated flavor that carried the whole dish. To start, the beef was rinsed, sometimes, chopped into smaller bits, and tossed into a skillet with a knob of butter. After a quick sauté, flour was sprinkled in to form a roux, and then milk was slowly added to create a thick, creamy gravy. The sauce bubbled and thickened, turning pale and glossy, speckled with little red-edged ribbons of beef. A dash of pepper or paprika could be added, but the flavor was mostly in the beef itself. Intensely savory, just shy of too salty, and incredibly satisfying when ladled over crispy, buttered toast. The shingle in question was usually white sandwich bread, toasted to golden brown, and stacked 2 slices deep under a generous pour of the meat-speckled sauce. It was warm, it was filling, and if you were feeding a family on a budget, it was a miracle. Served with canned fruit, green beans, or maybe a fried egg on top if you were feeling indulgent, chipped beef on toast was a complete meal, simple, salty, and sticking to your ribs in the best possible way. These days, it's often mentioned with a smirk or a nostalgic groan. But for many, SOS was the taste of childhood, of dinner time when times were tight, of a generation that learned to do a whole lot with very little. And sometimes, that's the flavor that lingers longest. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. In the 1960s, meatloaf wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual. Every home seemed to have its own version, usually scribbled on an index card, smudged with age, and tucked into the front of a weathered recipe box. It was dependable, economical, and above all, deeply comforting. But no matter the variation, one thing remained constant: that shiny, sweet red glaze on top. A thick slather of ketchup, sometimes mixed with brown sugar or a splash of vinegar, baked into a tangy crown that made meatloaf unmistakable. The loaf itself was a mixture of ground beef, sometimes with a little pork or veal if the budget allowed, blended with breadcrumbs or crushed saltines, an egg or two, and a generous pour of milk to keep it tender. Minced onion gave it bite, and maybe a dash of Worcestershire or dry mustard rounded out the flavor. Everything was mixed by hand in a big bowl, and pressed into a loaf pan or shaped freeform on a baking sheet, ready to take on that familiar brick-like form. As it baked, the ketchup glaze caramelized at the edges, creating a sticky, savory sweet crust that sealed in the juices. The smell was unmistakable, rich, homey, and full of promise. Sliced thick and served with mashed potatoes and green beans, it was a meal that felt like a hug from the inside out. Meatloaf was more than just a way to stretch a pound of beef. It was a centerpiece, a memory, and for many, the first real recipe they ever learned. And while gourmet trends have come and gone, that humble loaf with the ketchup glaze remains a timeless symbol of the American dinner table. Simple, sturdy, and made with love. Egg salad sandwiches. Tucked inside wax paper and packed in tin lunchboxes with a thermos of milk or juice, the egg salad sandwich was a lunchtime legend of the 1960s. It didn't shout for attention. It didn't need to. It was quiet, cool, and endlessly reliable. The sort of sandwich that showed up at school, at picnics, at tea parties, and on church potluck tables with equal grace. It may not have been flashy, but it earned its place with flavor, familiarity, and just the right amount of mayo. Egg salad was the great equalizer. Cheap, easy, and surprisingly versatile. In an era when protein had to stretch and nothing went to waste, a dozen eggs could feed an army, or at least a hungry family of 5. Boiling them was the first step, carefully timed on the stovetop, then cooled in a bowl of cold water before the peeling began, sometimes perfectly, sometimes not. The eggs were then chopped, either fine or chunky, depending on the cook's preference. The dressing was a simple affair. Mayonnaise, Miracle Whip if you had strong opinions, yellow mustard for a bit of zing, and a pinch of salt and pepper. Some added celery for crunch, pickle relish for tang, or a dash of paprika on top if you were feeling fancy. The salad was spooned generously onto soft white bread, always crustless for fancier occasions, always cut into diagonals for that nostalgic lunchbox charm. It was cool, creamy, and comforting, perfect for hot summer days or quiet afternoons. And somehow, despite its simplicity, it tasted like care, like someone took the time. Today, the egg salad sandwich might not win awards for innovation, but one bite and you're right back at that Formica table swinging your legs and wondering what's for dessert. Peach upside-down cake. In the 1960s, dessert didn't need to be delicate to dazzle. Enter peach upside-down cake, a golden syrupy showstopper that looked like sunshine and tasted like summer. It was a regular at family gatherings, church suppers, and backyard barbecues, where it would arrive in a glass baking dish, still warm from the oven, and just fancy enough to make an impression. With its glossy fruit topping and buttery vanilla crumb, this cake had one job: to make people smile, and it always did. The brilliance of the upside-down cake was its simplicity. You didn't need fresh peaches or a stand mixer, just a can opener and a little care. Canned peach halves or slices were the star, laid carefully over a base of melted butter and brown sugar that caramelized in the oven into a thick, sticky glaze. If you were lucky, you arranged the fruit in a beautiful pinwheel pattern, maybe even tucked a maraschino cherry in the center of each slice for that iconic pop of red. The batter was often made from a yellow cake mix because convenience was king, but it could also be whipped up from scratch with pantry staples: flour, sugar, eggs, milk, and a splash of vanilla. Once poured over the fruit, the cake baked until the edges turned golden and the kitchen filled with that unmistakable aroma of butter and warm stone fruit. Then came the flip. With a deep breath and a confident hand, the baker would invert the pan onto a platter, lifting it to reveal a glistening mosaic of peaches nestled into sticky, amber-hued sugar, served warm with a dollop of whipped cream or a scoop of vanilla ice cream. Peach upside-down cake was as comforting as it was nostalgic. A sweet reminder that sometimes the best things in life really are upside down. Bologna cheese pinwheels. Somewhere between a party platter and a packed lunch, Bologna cheese pinwheels twirled their way into the hearts and stomachs of 1960s America. These colorful little spirals were bite-sized fun with big-time retro appeal, served on paper plates at birthday parties, baby showers, bridge clubs, and school lunch tables. They weren't fancy, but they sure were proud of themselves. Neat little rolls of processed charm, always chilled just right, and often held together with a toothpick, like they were going somewhere important. The idea was simple. Take a slice of bologna, round, pink, smooth as vinyl, and lay it flat on a sheet of wax paper. Spread it with a thin layer of mayo or cream cheese, maybe even a dab of mustard if you were feeling spicy. Then came the cheese, usually American, its sunset orange hue glowing like it had a built-in backlight. Lay a slice on top, then roll the whole thing up tight like a jelly roll, wrap it in wax paper, and pop it into the fridge for an hour or two. Once it had chilled enough to hold its shape, the log was sliced into thick little coins, each one revealing that perfect Bologna cheese spiral. They were arranged in circles on party trays, maybe garnished with pickles or olives, and passed around like savory candy. And for kids especially, there was something thrilling about food you could eat with your fingers that came in little shapes that tasted cold and creamy and just a little salty. Pinwheels weren't about nutrition or culinary finesse. They were about fun, about ease, and about making something cute and clever from whatever was already in the fridge. They were the edible version of a good time, spinning their way through lunchboxes, potlucks, and mid-century memories, one happy bite at a time. Tamale pie. Tamale pie was the 1960s answer to the question, how can I make something hearty, flavorful, and vaguely exotic without leaving the comfort of my casserole dish? It was spicy, but not too spicy. Colorful and layered like a southwestern lasagna, warm with cumin, studded with corn, and always topped with a golden blanket of cornbread. In an era when Tex-Mex was just starting to enter the vocabulary of American home cooks, tamale pie was the delicious frontier between comfort food and culinary adventure. Though it borrowed its name from the traditional tamale, this pie was purely a domestic invention, more Midwest than Mexico, more Betty Crocker than Abuela. But it captured the spirit of something festive and filling, and it was a weeknight lifesaver for parents who wanted to make something different, but still simple, familiar, and affordable. The base layer was a savory, spiced ground beef filling. Cooks would brown the meat with chopped onion and garlic, then stir in canned tomatoes, tomato paste, or enchilada sauce, along with kidney beans or black olives if you had them, chili powder, cumin, and maybe a pinch of paprika gave it warmth without heat, and a can of whole kernel corn added a touch of sweetness and crunch. Once the filling was thick and bubbling, it was spooned into a baking dish and topped with a layer of cornbread batter, either homemade or straight from a Jiffy box. As it baked, the cornbread puffed up and browned, turning the whole dish into a kind of upside-down chili cake. You'd slice into it with a big spoon, lifting out layers of meat, vegetables, and fluffy golden corn, topping in one perfect scoop. Tamale pie was hearty, cheerful, and crowd-pleasing, a casserole with a kick and a smile. It brought a taste of the Southwest to the supper table, no passport required. Beef tips with rice. In the 1960s, if you were lucky enough to walk through the door after school or work and smell something savory bubbling low and slow on the stovetop, there was a good chance it was beef tips with rice. This dish wasn't flashy or fussy. It was quiet, rich, and deeply comforting, the kind of meal that filled your plate and your soul in equal measure. It came from the tradition of stretching tougher cuts of meat into something tender and saucy, a trick well known to home cooks who could turn a chuck roast into a masterpiece. Beef tips with rice was often made from stew meat or sliced sirloin, browned in a bit of oil until golden around the edges, then simmered until it surrendered to the fork. The gravy was the real star, built slowly with pan drippings, chopped onions, and beef broth, thickened with flour or a slurry of cornstarch and water. Sometimes a splash of red wine or Worcestershire sauce made its way in, maybe even a spoonful of ketchup for depth. The result was a velvety sauce that clung to every bite. Once the meat was tender and the gravy had thickened into glossy perfection, it was ladled over a generous mound of white rice. Some folks used mashed potatoes or egg noodles, but in most households, rice was the go-to. The grains soaked up the savory sauce, turning a simple starch into something downright luxurious. Served with green beans, buttered rolls, or maybe a wedge of iceberg lettuce with French dressing, beef tips with rice was a full meal with minimal effort. It was the kind of dish that said, "You're home now." A little old-fashioned, maybe, but that's what made it so right. It wasn't just food, it was reassurance by the spoonful. Potato boats, loaded baked potatoes. In the 1960s, before loaded became a buzzword on every restaurant menu, there were potato boats, a meal masquerading as a side dish, hearty enough to hold its own on the plate, and clever enough to feel like a little edible invention. These weren't just baked potatoes, they were scooped, stuffed, and re-baked to golden, cheesy perfection. Proudly served at family dinners, luncheons, and the occasional potluck, potato boats were a mid-century marvel of simplicity and indulgence. The process started with good, starchy russet potatoes, baked until their skins were crisp and their insides fluffy. Then came the fun part, slicing them in half lengthwise and carefully scooping out the centers, creating little hollowed-out shells, like canoes ready to be filled. The fluffy potato insides were mashed with butter, a splash of milk, and maybe a dollop of sour cream for richness. Then came the extras, crumbled bacon, shredded cheddar cheese, chopped green onions, or whatever leftovers the fridge had to offer. The filling was spooned, or piped if you were feeling fancy, back into the skins, mounded high like clouds ready to brown. A sprinkle of paprika might add color, a few bacon bits gave crunch, and more cheese on top was practically required. Then they went back into the oven, just long enough to heat through and melt everything into one gooey, golden-topped package. Served hot with steam rising and cheese stretching from fork to mouth, potato boats were the kind of meal that made everyone happy. They were thrifty, yet satisfying, elegant, yet down-home. You could serve them with a salad and call it dinner, or plate them next to a steak and feel like royalty. In an age of ingenuity, these potatoes set sail, and they've never really come back. Corned beef hash. There's something deeply nostalgic about corned beef hash, a dish that crackles in a skillet on a quiet morning, filling the kitchen with the smell of fried potatoes, salty meat, and a touch of something smoky. In the 1960s, this was a breakfast for dinner favorite, a hearty brunch dish, or a leftover miracle made with a can opener and a hot pan. Whether homemade or scooped from a can with that satisfying slurp, corned beef hash was the epitome of frugal comfort food, resourceful, filling, and fried to perfection. Hash has deep roots in American kitchens, especially during and after wartime, when leftovers had to stretch and every scrap of meat was precious. By the 60s, it was as much a diner classic as it was a home staple, often served with eggs on top, poached, fried, or scrambled, and a side of toast ready to mop up the crispy bits. The canned version was especially popular. Corned beef, already chopped and packed with tiny bits of potato, onion, and salt, came ready to fry. All you had to do was heat a skillet, preferably cast iron, plop it in, and break it up with a spatula. With a little patience and some gentle pressing, the hash crisped into a golden brown crust that was as satisfying to look at as it was to eat. For home cooks who made it from scratch, leftover boiled corned beef, often from Sunday supper or St. Patrick's Day, was chopped finely and mixed with diced potatoes and onions. A bit of butter or bacon grease got everything sizzling, and some added green peppers or a splash of hot sauce for extra zip. No matter how it came together, corned beef hash was honest food, humble, salty, comforting, and when topped with a runny egg, it felt like a little triumph. One bite, and the world slowed down just enough to appreciate it. Pineapple chicken skewers. For a brief, delicious moment in the 1960s, America fell head over heels for all things tropical. Enter pineapple chicken skewers, a dinner that felt like a luau on a weeknight. Inspired by the rising tide of tiki culture and backyard grilling, these sweet and savory skewers brought a splash of island flair to suburban patios and electric broilers alike. Chunks of chicken breast were marinated in a mixture of pineapple juice, soy sauce, brown sugar, and a hint of garlic, just enough to soak up that sweet, tangy flavor. Threaded onto wooden skewers between bright yellow pineapple chunks, green bell peppers, and red onion wedges, the kebabs were a rainbow on a stick. Grilled over charcoal or baked under the broiler, the glaze caramelized into a glossy coating, turning the chicken golden and slightly crisp at the edges. The pineapple sizzled and softened, releasing bursts of juice with every bite. Served over white rice or alongside a wedge of iceberg lettuce and French dressing, pineapple chicken skewers were both exotic and accessible. A little fancy, a little fun, and completely 1960s. One bite, and you were on a vacation. No plane ticket required, just a backyard and a pair of tongs. These dishes may have faded from the spotlight, but their flavors still whisper from old cookbooks and family memories. They were built from simplicity, from cans and creativity, from love and leftovers. In every spoonful of casserole or bite of meatloaf, there's a story of resourceful cooks, bustling kitchens, and the joy of gathering around a humble table. So bring one back, make it your own. Because the food we grew up on, the food that fed a generation, deserves more than nostalgia. It deserves another night in the oven, another seat at the table, one more bite, one more memory.